This is the Marxists at the Movies podcast.
Scene opens, white lights dim down low. The cinema whispers where truths can grow. From shadows deep and screens ignite, the proletariat comes alive tonight. Marxists at the movies, bright and raw, breaking through the reels to rewrite the law. Workers of the world in every frame, changing the credits, rewriting the name.
All right, comrade, welcome back to Marxists at the Movies, where we take a look at the silver screen through a dialectical lens, you know?
Precisely, comrade. Always a pleasure to be back, dissecting the cinematic superstructure, you know?
You know it. And today we're tackling a real classic, one that's got those layers of meaning that we love to peel back. We're talking West Side Story.
Ah, yes. A tale of two cities, or perhaps more accurately, a tale of two gangs. A story as old as time itself, you know, conflict and desire set against a backdrop of...
Capitalism gone wild, right? I mean,
Yeah.
gentrification, social alienation, the whole nine yards. And we've got a real treasure trove of material for this deep dive, looking at both a 1961 classic and Spielberg's take on it in 2021.
We've got some real gems here, comrades. Everything from, you know, behind-the-scenes scoops to some really sharp sociopolitical critiques, and even some, let's just say some alternative readings of the music itself.
Oh, yeah, some folks really went deep on the musical subtext there. But a fair warning to our listeners, comrade, we're going full spoiler alert here in the name of ideological clarity. We're going to be dissecting plot points with revolutionary fervor.
Absolutely, comrade. No sacred cows in the struggle for truth.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. So our mission today, comrades, is to understand how these films, you know, how they grapple with the struggles of the marginalized, the nature of that conflict, you know, between groups, and whether they ultimately, you know, do they reinforce or challenge those dominant capitalist narratives?
The eternal question, comrade. The struggle between art and ideology, you know.
It's a good one. So let's get right into it. Let's start at the beginning with the very genesis of this story.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how Jerome Robbins, you know, his initial idea was a conflict between Catholic and Jewish gangs, and how that evolved.
Yeah, it's really telling, isn't it? I mean, the thing that really sparked that shift, it seems, was a real-life event, a 1955 Los Angeles Times headline about Chicano gang violence, really caught Bernstein and Laurent's attention.
Oh, wow. So they were really tapping into those real-world tensions.
Oh, absolutely. And that became the crucible, you know, where that dynamic between the Puerto Rican and white gangs, initially Irish or Polish in their minds, was forged. And, of course, you can't ignore the setting the Upper West Side in the throes of, slum clearance to make way for Lincoln Center.
Yeah, talk about a powder keg. I mean, you've got displacement, urban renewal, all those forces feeding into the characters, their desperation and territoriality, right?
Precisely. It's not just about turf, it's about survival, you know, under these really oppressive conditions.
And the historical context, too, right? We can't forget about the banning of the original lyrics of Labor in Kenya and Puerto Rico in the mid-50s. Talk about cultural suppression, man.
Absolutely. It speaks volumes about the political climate back then, the struggle for self-determination, the suppression of voices. You know,
it's all connected, comrade.
Yeah.
So we're seeing how the very foundation of West Side Story, it's rooted in those social and political anxieties of its time.
Oh yeah, they weren't just creating in a vacuum; they were responding to, reflecting those real world tensions they were seeing all around them.
It adds a whole other layer to the story, right? So let's move on to the original production, the 1957 Broadway premiere that really shook things up before it hit the big screen in 61.
Ah, yes. Broadway in 57, what a moment. Leonard Bernstein's score. Of course, the lyrics, those sharp, socially conscious lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, Arthur Laurent's book, and of course, Jerome Robbins, his revolutionary choreography, it all came together.
It was a real meeting of the minds, right? Like a true convergence of artistic forces.
Yeah, it was groundbreaking stuff, especially Robbins' choreography. I mean, the way he integrated dance into the narrative itself, it was like nothing anyone had seen before.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, though, because despite all that innovation, the initial reception on Broadway, it was kind of mixed, you know?
Why is that?
Well, you know, some of the more let's say the bourgeois audiences, they weren't quite ready for that raw depiction of gang violence and death. It made them a little uncomfortable. And you know what? It actually lost the Tony for Best Musical that year.
No way. Seriously, who beat it?
The Music Man of all things. It's funny, though, because one of the most iconic numbers from the show, Gee, Officer Krupke, it actually originated in an earlier Bernstein work. You might not know this one. Candide. It was called Where Does It Get You in the End?
Oh, wow. That's a great little bit of trivia there. It just goes to show how art can reflect those societal contradictions.
Absolutely. And speaking of contradictions, let's talk about the 1961 film adaptation.
All right, let's do it. This is where it gets interesting.
Directed by Robert Wise, co-directed and choreographed by Robbins. It just exploded onto the scene. Massive popular success, swept the Oscars, 10 wins, including Best Picture.
Yeah, the whole shebang.
Yeah.
And that cast, Natalie Wood as Maria, or Richard Beymer as Tony.
Rita Moreno as Anita. Of course, she won a well-deserved supporting actress Oscar for that performance.
She was incredible. And George Takeiras as Bernardo, he snagged a supporting actor Oscar too.
Oh, and we can't forget Russ Tamblyn as Riff. He brought a certain energy to that role.
Yeah. Definitely. So we've got this huge hit on our hands, but it's interesting to see how critics viewed it back then and how those perspectives have evolved over time, right?
Absolutely. Take Ebert, for example, in his retrospective review. He talks about how it was initially seen as, this good for them liberalism, like a sort of superficial nod to social issues.
Yeah.
But now looking back, it seems almost naive compared to the realities we face today.
Yeah, it's a product of its time, for sure.
But he still acknowledges the brilliance of the music, the power of those performances, especially Moreno and Shakiri's, and of course Robbins' dynamic choreography. But he does critique the ending a bit. Tony's death, while tragic, it doesn't quite have that full weight of collective loss, and Maria surviving, well, it feels like a bit of a concession.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And then there's Doc's whole stop fighting message. It's a classic example of that bourgeois individualism that ignores the systemic issues at play, right?
Exactly. Now, contrast that with Pauline Kael's review.
Mm-hmm.
She really went in on the film.
Well, yeah, she did not hold back.
She called it frenzied hokum, painfully old-fashioned, even labeled Natalie Wood as banal, which is... a bit harsh, I think.
Yeah. She was good. She wasn't banal.
No, not at all. But it's interesting to compare that to Kaufman's view. He called it the best film musical ever made. But even he acknowledged some shortcomings.
Yeah.
The lack of true resolution, the somewhat superficial engagement with sociology, and that ultimately false sense of reconciliation.
It's like the film itself is caught in these contradictions, right? Trying to depict real social conflict within that Hollywood framework.
Exactly. And speaking of contradictions, the behind-the-scenes stories, they really highlight the struggles inherent in making this film. Robbins' choreography is groundbreaking as it was also incredibly demanding. 3 months of rehearsal, constant revisions, even on location, and those complex rhythms. Bernstein wasn't messing around. 54/68 time signatures.
Yeah, I've heard stories about those rhythms. They were tough on the dancers.
Oh, yeah. Injuries, exhaustion. It took its toll. Rita Moreno herself has talked about how, professional dancers are used to counts of 4 or 8, not Bernstein's intricate patterns.
It's almost like a metaphor for the struggles of those living under capitalism, isn't it? That constant pressure, that relentless demand for performance.
A very insightful observation, comrade. But amidst all that struggle, some truly iconic musical numbers emerged. Numbers that, even with that Hollywood sheen, still managed to pack a punch.
Oh, absolutely. Let's talk about America from the 61 film. It's a sharp, satirical look at immigrant assimilation, contrasting those hopes and dreams of the women with the harsh realities faced by the men.
And that line, life is all right in America if you're all white in America. Man, that's a gut punch right there. It cuts right to the heart of the American dream's inherent exclusions.
It's brutal. And it really speaks to the conflicted and ultimately false promises of capitalist democracy for marginalized communities. Our source, West Side Story, class warfare in 54 time, really nails it on that point.
Yeah, they really break it down how the women are singing about opportunity and freedom while the men are grounded in that lived experience of racism, exploitation, and the struggle for survival.
It's a powerful juxtaposition. And then you've got Cool the Jets trying to, keep it together, evade the cops after the rumble.
Oh, yeah, that tension, you can feel it right through the screen. The choreography, the music, it all builds to this sense of anxiety and fear.
It really speaks to that constant surveillance and criminalization of working class youth, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And then, of course, there's G. Officer Krupke, that brilliantly dark and satirical take on the so-called juvenile justice system.
Oh man, that song is a classic. It's like a direct indictment of how capitalist society would rather criminalize and pathologize working class youth than actually address the root causes of their alienation.
Yeah, it's a brilliant parody that exposes the hypocrisy and the failure of the system to provide any real support or opportunity.
It's a timeless message, really.
Mhm.
So let's fast forward a few decades and talk about Spielberg's 2021 adaptation, a whole new generation experiencing the story with a screenplay by the one and only Tony Kushner.
Ah, yes. Spielberg himself has talked about his lifelong connection to West Side Story and how its themes, sadly have become even more relevant today.
Especially with all the social divisions and political turmoil we've been seeing.
One source even mentioned Trump's nomination as a motivating factor for Spielberg to revisit this story.
Wow, so it's like history repeating itself, right? But this remake, it really aimed for a greater sense of authenticity, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The casting was all Latino actors in Latino roles, lots of Spanish dialogue without subtitles, thankfully, and a much deeper engagement with Puerto Rican culture. Even the film opens with La Borinqueña, the Puerto Rican national anthem, which, as we know, has a history of being suppressed.
That's a powerful statement right there. And the cast was stellar Ansel Elgort as Tony Rachel Zegler, as Maria, the phenomenal Ariana DeBose, as Anita, who earned another Oscar for the role.
And, of course, the legendary Rita Moreno returning to the West Side Story universe as Valentina Doc's widow.
Oh, yeah, that was such a brilliant move. I mean, to have her come back and play this new character with ties to the community, it's like bridging those two cinematic interpretations.
Absolutely.
Oh.
And it allows Moreno to bring her own lived experience and understanding of the story into this new version. And the remake expands the narrative, too, gives more depth to characters like Anita Riff, Bernardo Chino, even. Anybody's portrayed with more nuance in terms of their gender identity.
Yeah. It's like they fleshed out the world a bit more, gave those supporting characters more agency. In Tony and Maria's relationship, it's less of that love at first sight thing and more grounded in shared experiences. They even have their first date at the Cloisters Museum.
It's more realistic, more relatable.
Yeah.
And the film doesn't shy away from the socioeconomic realities either. That slum clearance sign is a constant reminder of gentrification and how it's impacting both the Puerto Rican and poor white communities.
Yeah. It really drives home the point that they're all victims of the same system in the end.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And the opening sequence is much more confrontational than the original. We see right away that Tony is haunted by a past act of manslaughter. It sets a darker tone right from the start.
It's like they're acknowledging the cycle of violence that's perpetuated by inequality. And the remake also delves deeper into the racial divide and those questions of identity, particularly through Anita's story.
Yeah, she really goes through the ringer in this version. And Riff is portrayed as more nihilistic, almost embodying that born to die young mentality.
Yeah.
And the song Cool, it's reimagined as Tony's plea to Riff to abandon violence.
It's a powerful shift. And the gun becomes a much more central symbol representing that destructive power of oppression.
And Bernardo's motivations are more complex, too. He's not just a hothead. He's a protector of his community.
Yeah, it makes him a more sympathetic character, even though he's still, kind of antagonistic.
And the assault on Anita by the Jets, it's much more explicit in this version. There's no doubt about the implied attempted rape.
Yeah.
And Valentina's condemnation of them is so powerful, she calls them out directly, grown into rapists, she says.
Wow. That's a heavy accusation. And visually, Spielberg uses a lot more fluid camera movement, especially during the dance sequences. It creates a different kind of energy.
It's more visceral, more immediate. And the placement of some of the songs adds to the thematic weight, too.
Mm-hmm.
If You're Pretty, for example, takes place in Gimbel's department store, highlighting the contrast between Maria's working class life and the allure of consumerism.
It's like a commentary on the false promises of material wealth.
Exactly. And somewhere, traditionally, a duet between Tony and Maria is now sung by Valentina as a lament for Doc, a yearning for a lost piece.
It's a beautiful and heartbreaking moment. And in a poignant twist, Maria sings a line from Tonight to Tony as he's dying.
It emphasizes the enduring power of their love, even in the face of tragedy.
Uh-huh.
And G. Officer Krupke is performed by the Jets while they're detained at the police station. It underscores their defiance, but also the systemic failures of law enforcement.
Yeah, it's like they're trapped in the system no matter what they do. And Lieutenant Schrank, he's a much more overtly racist and manipulative figure in this version.
He's the embodiment of that oppressive authority figure. And the ending is a stark contrast to the original Maria. Maria defers to the police, and in a powerful final image, the Sharks and Jets leave together carrying Tony's body.
It's a somber reminder of the cost of this conflict, the loss of innocence and the enduring power of grief.
It's a powerful ending for sure.
Yeah.
So Spielberg managed to honor the legacy of the original while also bringing his own vision and social commentary to the story.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears a bit and delve into the Marxist analysis of West Side Story as presented in our source, West Side Story: Class Warfare in 54 Time.
Ah, yes. This perspective offers a really interesting lens through which to view the film. It argues that the violence and territoriality displayed by Riff and Bernardo are not simply about individual aggression or ethnic hatred, but rather a consequence of their lack of power within a capitalist system.
So it's not just a turf war, it's a class war.
Precisely. And their deaths are seen as symbolic of the ruling class, using horizontal violence conflict between groups on the same social level to prevent vertical revolution, a unified uprising of the proletariat.
That's a pretty radical interpretation.
It is, but it makes you think about the power dynamics at play. And the characters of Doc and Valentina, they're seen as representing that liberal appeal for peace and reconciliation without addressing the underlying inequalities.
So they're like well-meaning but ultimately ineffective.
Exactly. They embody the limitations of reformism within a system built on exploitation. And what about Bernstein's score? The article argues that it's not just background music, but a reflection of the social unrest and instability of life under capitalism.
Like the music itself is a form of protest.
In a way, yes, those discordant rhythms, those clashing melodies, they mirror the chaos and the tension of the characters' lives.
It's brilliant. And then there's the analysis of specific songs like America and G. Officer Krupke.
America is seen as a satire of the false promises of assimilation, the women's hopes versus the men's realities. It exposes the hollowness of the American dream for marginalized communities. And G. Officer Kripke, it's a critique of how the capitalist state criminalizes and pathologizes working-class youth.
It's all connected, right? It all goes back to that core critique of capitalism.
Absolutely. Now, let's not forget about the musical analysis from the Sideways YouTube channel. They offer a fascinating look at the deeper meaning embedded within Bernstein's score.
Oh, yeah. I loved their breakdown. They pointed out that central conflict motif that runs throughout the film, right? Characterized by dissonance and danger.
Yes, and even the Jets motif is essentially an inversion of that conflict motif, highlighting how pervasive it is. And interestingly, they noted that the police are musically aligned with the Jets.
Oh, wow. So even the music is reinforcing that power dynamic.
Precisely. And Maria motif is a rearrangement of the conflict motif, but offset by a perfect octave, suggesting that Tony and Maria represent a potential resolution to the conflict.
So their love is like a glimmer of hope amidst all that darkness.
Exactly. And the absence of the conflict motif in moments of connection, like during America and tonight, it signifies a temporary escape from that discord. But then it returns in G. Officer Krupke, reinforcing the Jets' connection to the social tensions.
It's like the music is telling a story of its own alongside the narrative.
Absolutely. And they also delved into the rhythmic complexities of America, that hop-hang-go feel that reflects the push and pull of assimilation. And the melody of I Feel Pretty is built from perfect fourths, suggesting stability, but also a fleeting moment of peace.
It's so subtle, but so effective. And then there's that analysis of the harmonic language during Tony and Maria's mock wedding. They modulate to keys that are a tritone apart, a really dissonant interval that symbolizes the opposition they face.
It's a brilliant musical representation of their different backgrounds and the societal forces trying to keep them apart. And in somewhere, the use of perfect intervals signifies the longing for escape, but the avoidance of a perfect octave leap hints at the unattainability of true peace.
It's like they're so close to happiness, but always just out of reach. And then the conflict motif returns when Anita almost discovers Tony, reminding us of the ever-present danger.
And the modulation by a tritone in a, boy, like That and I Have a Love represents Anita's shift in perspective as she grapples with grief and betrayal.
It's like the music is mirroring her emotional turmoil. And even during the assault on Anita, they use a distorted version of America, highlighting the shattering of her dreams.
It's a really powerful moment. And the Sideways analysis ends with that unresolved alternating tritone in the orchestra at the very end of the film.
It's like a final reminder that the conflict is far from over.
Exactly. That social unrest, that tension, it lingers even after the credits roll.
It's a haunting ending for sure. And speaking of endings, let's wrap up with the West Side Story. Hammer and sickle rating. They gave the original 1961 film a 3.6 out of 5 sickles, and the 2021 remake a 4.5.
Not bad scores, comrade. And their overall assessment, a capitalist hellscape in Technicolor demanding solidarity.
It's a pretty apt description, I'd say. So what does all this mean for our listeners out there navigating this crazy world of cinematic ideology?
Well, it seems clear that West Side Story in both its iterations offers a potent commentary on social divisions, prejudice, and the underlying inequalities of a capitalist system.
The original, while groundbreaking for its time, perhaps ultimately falls short in its plea for tolerance and understanding, as that Marxist analysis pointed out.
But the remake, with its emphasis on authenticity and its unflinching look at systemic issues like gentrification and racism, it definitely sharpens the focus on the material conditions that fuel the conflict.
And let's not forget about the music. It's more than just catchy tunes. It's a language that speaks to power dynamics, longing for connection, and the ever-present threat of social unrest.
Bernstein's score is a masterpiece in its own right.
Absolutely. So we have to ask ourselves, comrades, how do narratives like West Side Story shape our understanding of conflict? Do they offer paths towards solidarity, or do they simply aestheticize real struggle?
It's a question worth pondering. And that brings us to the end of another deep dive into the world of cinema through a Marxist lens.
For Marxists at the Movies, this has been a look at the class conflict, cultural clashes, and cinematic brilliance of West Side Story. Until next time, comrades, stay critical.
And stay vigilant.
You know what? Marxists at the Movies.
That's a
Look
right.
out.
Scene opens, white lights dim down low.
Thank you for listening to the Marxists at the Movies podcast.
Cinema whispers
Don't
where
forget to
truths
like
can
and comment.
grow. From shadows deep and screens ignite, the proletariat comes alive tonight. Tonight, Marxists at the movies, bright and raw, breaking through the reels to rewrite the law. Workers of the world in every frame, changing the credits, rewriting the name. Popcorn power and the working class